It had been just over 2 weeks since the world went dark, desperate, and dangerous. 2 weeks since my downstairs neighbor Brian vacated our building, joining forces with a local deputy Michael and a handful of others to help look after the local senior center and the 100 plus elders who inhabited the two-story structure. With our help, they had taken control of the neighboring gas station, allowing them limitless access to valuable petrol to feed their backup generators. A building with power, heat, clean linens, clothes, the ability to receive fresh haircuts, hot coffee, watch classic and renowned DVDs, listen to quintessential music on CDs, and receive hot meals was the closest thing to normal this sinister society offered. Let's be honest, the near full underground fuel tanks would probably outlast dozens of the medicine-dependent seniors. The group of watchmen's main objective was to keep the residents safe and provide the best end-of-life care for the elders they could during this precarious and unpredictable time. We were only days away from ringing in an unwelcoming and demoralizing new year. By now, most knew no help was coming, and things would only continue to spiral perilously out of control in 2021. Many would never make it to the spring. Surviving a cataclysmic collapse during the winter months of doomsday was just not something the average person was prepared for. Fighting off frostbite, hypothermia, dehydration, starvation, disease, loneliness, and the most murderous of menacing threats would be a tall order for even the most prepared and organized. 2+ weeks in, and still offering some of life's modern luxuries, the independent senior living facility had a giant target on its back. It was only a matter of time and opportunity before chaos, madness, and anarchy breached the front door. People were raised to believe there was no such thing as monsters, but in this new world, they definitely existed. They were just disguised as familiar faces you would see out and about around town when you used to run errands. The remaining remnants of the sinners of society was a band of 8 looters, a group made up of criminals and wrongdoers. The majority had criminal records, but thanks to New York's newly passed bail reform laws, most had evaded doing prison time. This was a state where carjackings, home burglaries, larceny, aggravated assaults, and even illegally possessing a firearm, you could be booked, processed, and back out on the street the same day. Now, without the threat of law enforcement and a society without rule of law, these swine had grown even more dangerous and brazen. The group had been moving from neighborhood to neighborhood, from house to house, moving like locusts, devouring everything in their footpath. Armed with light weapons they had acquired throughout their encounters of savagery and murder, they were only growing more confident and corrupt. They had developed simple plans of attack and had been successful on 12 out of their 13 hits. The only depletion they experienced was running into our grid-down survival gang. Although we were successful in the battle, they did manage to dispatch of Blake and Jennifer's daughter, commit vile and repulsive acts of sexual assault, and reduce our dwelling to a rubble of smoldering ash. And that was with a group that was half the size of the remaining monsters who were running roughshod over our small community. They preferred none of their victims survived the ungodly encounters. A wounded, but albeit living survivor could potentially cause problems for them in the future. Many innocent and harmless individuals were settling into what was most likely a prolonged and harsh existence 16 days into the collapse. The everyday tasks of fighting for survival were finally becoming routine. Information and news from the outside was frustratingly limited. While families were holed up and trying to remain optimistic, the sinners of society were watching them, waiting to seize their property, supplies, and their women. Intelligence collecting and target selection was vital to the group's success. The easier the target, the easier the mission. Seniors were their favorite group to prey upon for obvious reasons. Victims were often tortured and interrogated for critical information. They wanted details on surrounding neighbors. How many people occupied the residence? Did they have dogs? What was their occupation before the rapture erupted? Who seems well fed? Who has transportation? Who has a generator? And who is a prepper? The group hunted day and night. During the day, they'd listen for the reverberating sound of generators, smoke from chimneys, loud voices, and the savoring smell of food. Without a lot of wind, it was amazing how far sounds could travel in a world without electricity. At night, they'd look for any type of light. If you were careless with your operational security and they saw your candles or flashlights, you and your loved ones were going to suffer violent horrors. Once they locked in on a target, observation of your residence was their next step. They were careful and calculated not to rush in and make a fatal mistake. The larger the payoff, the longer they waited to perform their ambush. They wanted to recognize your routine, your numbers, and observe your security. Most of the time, they'd wait to begin their attack just before dawn, when senses are dulled from long nights of pulling security watch or from sleep. Once the roving squad of sinners initiated their assault, they'd quickly dispatch of the males, before feeding and satisfying their sexual desire with any and all female occupants. The quantity of resources inside determined how long they would hole up at each house of horror. There had been days where the nefarious monsters had hit multiple houses, leaving behind a trail of blood and unspeakable atrocities. One fateful night, the grisly group stumbled upon a modest ranch that was within eyesight of the Burnandary gas station that the senior center oversaw. The house belonged to a pair of 20-something newlyweds who had welcomed their first child, a daughter, into the world just a month prior. Absent-minded with their light security, due to the complications of raising and keeping a baby healthy during the days of doom, the sinners of society had found their next victims. They surrounded the house like a hungry pack of hyenas. Splitting into 2 teams of 4, they began their reconnaissance. One group set up in the front of the house, covering both the east and west ends of the ranch. The second group of 4 made their way to the backyard. The house backed up to a woodline of thick Norway maples, the perfect cover to sit, wait, watch, and eventually pounce on the unsuspecting prey. Less than 40 minutes into their observation, and sometime well past midnight, the sleep-deprived, famished, and frightened father stumbled out of the back door to relieve himself after finally getting his daughter back to sleep. Little did he know the barbarity that awaited him. Trudging through the darkness, he set up facing the towering 4-story maple tree he despised because of all the fallen leaves it produced in the fall. Na-na-na-na-na-na-na. Target acquired, he mumbled, and began urinating on the frozen, snow-covered bark. Unbeknownst to him, just 5 feet away, evil was lurking in the dark. Close enough to hear him breathing, close enough to smell his blood-stained clothes, but too oblivious to even notice. The sinner blitzed, rushing the heedless husband, left hand grabbing his back, right hand to the back of his head and forcefully driving it in to the hardened tree trunk. His bare forehead immediately exploded open, soiling the pure white snow below. He was rendered useless and was incapacitated before his body collapsed into his own pool of urine. The deplorable devils instantly gagged him and binded him to that same tree, shades of the BTK serial killer. While 2 stood with the battered, unconscious father, the remaining 6 sinners slipped in the back door he had foolishly left ajar. They began clearing the house, room by room, hunting for the remaining victims. The emergency candle, once burning bright in the front window that alerted the huntsman to the house in the first place, was quietly extinguished by one of the fiends. The union of 6 quickly split into 3 teams of 2, always staying organized and calculated. 2 negotiated the basement stairs. Two traversed through the kitchen and living room, and the final two slowly plodded down the hallway, clearing bedrooms. The final door on the right, at the end of the hallway, had a candlelight illuminating out from under the doorway. The innocent sound of a baby cooing and babble could be heard coming from the room. The mother awoke to two of the sinners sitting on her bed. One was holding the baby. He had pulled out his knife and carefully sliced his left index finger open, was drawing blood marks all over the infant's cheeks. She froze. Couldn't talk, couldn't move, completely petrified and paralyzed in fear. "Rise and shine, sweetheart," the other sinner muttered, with a sick, vile smirk on his face. Panic-stricken and in shock, she was mouthing the words she was trying to vocalize, but nothing was coming out. "What's that, sweetheart? I can't hear you," the repulsive ravager asked. By now, the four other sinners who had been clearing the dwelling made their way into the bedroom, helping to multiply her fear factor. 6 evil, homicidal monsters, all staring at her, with lust in their eyes and blood on their hands. 2 of the miscreants grabbed her by the legs, forcefully pulling her off the bed and onto the cold, inhospitable floor. They proceeded to drag her down the now dark and unwelcoming hallway, violently, with no regard for her well-being. She tried desperately to grab onto anything she could to slow the injustice down. A trail of nail marks was left behind on the wood floor and on door jambs as they continued dragging her out through the living room and onto the kitchen. She hopelessly reached for the leg of the kitchen table, but the power and force of the 2 culprits was just too much. They vigorously slid the sliding glass door open and continued out to the backyard as her body bounced over the door track, down the 2 steps, and into the cold, frozen snow. Using a flashlight they had looted from a previous victim, they shined it on her husband's face that had now been carved up like it was a jack-o'-lantern. He was now conscious, albeit barely. His entire face was crimson red as copious amounts of blood rolled down it, saturating his clothes. Finally, for the first time since she awoke to the abominable horrors, she let out a deafening scream that echoed throughout the chaotic apocalyptic night. It took every bit of energy he could muster to utter the 4 words. "Lori, I love you." Those were the last 4 words he would ever speak as a succession of gunshots penetrated his chest. His wife instantly blacked out as the nauseating nightmare continued to play out. Over the course of the next few hours, she would randomly awaken to being viciously assaulted on her bed by different sinners as her infant daughter cried uncontrollably in her bassinet at the foot of the same bed. Gangs already ruled the dark underground of modern cities before civilization collapsed. Now in a dystopian society, they were unleashed and unbounded, enabled by all the chaos and madness that has become the new reality. Survivors living in big cities and even the population-dense suburbs like our small town would be subjected to a very cruel and inhumane environment. If the horror and trepidation was playing out in a community of under 30,000, just imagine the atrocities and brutality happening in New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, and every other megalopolis. Many of us believed we'd somehow manage to make it on our own in a full-blown grid-down collapse. The eventual confrontation with roving raiders, hostile foraging gangs, and monstrous murderers of the midnight hour will eventually make their way to your front door. It's all about numbers. 5, 10, 20, or more of them, and just a few of you. Who's going to live and who's going to perish? Early the next morning, peering out through the window, the sinners witnessed a very lethargic and slothful Brian and his ally Michael filling gasoline containers at the Burn and Dairy. 17 days since his last dialysis appointment, Brian was now living on borrowed time. The sinners of society had their next victims in their crosshairs of annihilation and slaughter.